Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our April 13th of the month event. We are going to be starting off with a journaling prompt. So I hope everyone has a pen and paper handy, since that's going to be the first thing we're going to be doing for just a few minutes. I just want to welcome everyone to the space as we discuss motherhood and white supremacy this evening. Dana, if you could take us to our journaling prompts. All right, everyone, we can bring our journaling to a close. I want us to kind of be keeping what you've written kind of in the back of your mind as we move through this discussion. And we will circle back around to it at the end of the discussion. But thank you for joining us in that activity. I want to thank my BRJA family for joining me this evening. I'm joined by Erica and Anthony and Rebecca. And as I said, we're going to be delving into the conversation around how motherhood and white supremacy intersect, how white supremacy affects motherhood and parenting, and also how white motherhood has been used to uphold white supremacy. Erica, did you want to take a few seconds and also introduce our other guest?
I will. I just wanted to give a shout out to a very, very special guest, Mrs. Yvonne Leacock, who's joining us today. She is the dear friend of one of my mothers, my grandmother, she, as she said herself, she could be all of our grandmothers. And I thought it would be really interesting to have her perspective here. As you know, as an African-American woman in Baltimore who's raised, I believe, 4 kids. Am I right about that?
4
kids, and the evolution of her or her decisions to do parenting in a different way than what we typically hear about in African-American families. Did you want to say anything? Want to say hello to the folks?
Oh, hello, everybody. I'm all ears to hear this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica. Okay, so we are going to now move to the slide that's going to have actually, I'm sorry, let me back up. I want to give a little bit of historical perspective before we go into the terms, some of the terms we're going to be using this evening. So we did our journaling prompt. We reflected on things that come to mind when we think of the word motherhood. And I just want to kind of frame this conversation so that we have a little bit of historical context as we move forward in the conversation, which here at BRJA, we always think is very important to do. So when we talk about how motherhood affects parenting, we need to be very much aware of the history and the images that come from that history, right? And so unfortunately, as Black people here in America, we have a very long and painful history of slavery and the damage that did to the parent and child relationship, the mother and child relationship, and that was very intentional damage, right? That this was intentional damage that went on for generations, and how it affected the culture of parenting that we have as Black people in this country. It affects the way that we look at Black mothers due to this painful history. So I just want us to be thinking about that as we go through this conversation, that on the one hand, we have Black families that were separated. You know, things would happen like if the master died, all of his property would be split up amongst different family members. That included Black families being split up, right? So just be thinking about that as we move through this conversation. And I want to share a quote from Frederick Douglass, who was a slave here in Maryland on the Eastern Shore. And I just want to share that with you all quickly. And I'll read it aloud, Erica, so that all of our guests can hear. So again, this quote is from Frederick Douglass talking about his mother. "My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away, to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off. And the child is placed under the care of an old woman too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child toward its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. I never saw my mother nor her as such more than 4 or 5 times in my life. And each of these times was very short in duration and at night. So once again, this is Frederick Douglass talking about his mother. She was working on a plantation separate from him that was a considerable distance away. Some of you may know that he has two or three different autobiographies, and in another one, he talks about how his mother actually walked by foot after she worked in the fields all day, just so she could sleep with him for a few hours. And those are the 4 or 5 times that he even got to spend time with his mother, right? So this is a true account of a Black person enslaved here in Maryland in the 1800s, so not that long ago. So when we talk about this history of slavery and how it affects motherhood and Black mothers and Black children, and how Black mothers are seen and treated and how Black children are seen as treated, we need to always remember that this is the context that we're coming from. This is the history we're coming from. And that this is next to the images that we have of white motherhood, right? A lot of times when we are talking about white motherhood and we talk about the cult of domesticity, right? And this idea and this concept that white mothers are to be in the home and that is their job and that is their full-time job. We usually hear words like innocence and purity around that, right? And at the same time, we have Black mothers who don't even have the option of being full-time mothers, right? Most Black women historically, even after slavery, are working as domesticated workers inside white homes, raising white children, and then going home to raise their children, right? So these are the dichotomies that are happening historically in this country, around this conversation. And even today, typically, Black mothers don't usually make enough money to be able to stay home. Black households don't normally have enough money compared to white households, right? Because there is still this discrepancy in pay between white households and Black households.
Michelle, can I add something here? Because I think we would be remiss if we did not also simultaneously acknowledge how these images of motherhood also play into capitalist priorities.
Right.
Because everything you've said about how Black mothers are perceived, even Frederick Douglass' own quote, is because of the labor and the capitalist priorities that required that separation, because it made it harder, for the sale and production of people who were thought as just commodities, right? And also there are like these, and how, when you talked about the occult of domesticity, it is a extension of the occult of Victorian womanhood, right? Where there's a pristineness around white womanhood and white womanhood sensibilities, from which motherhood is. The dirtiness of that happens by Black women.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you for that, Erica. You're completely right. That these white women were not, even though it was their full-time jobs, they were not running these households alone. They were doing it with the help of Black women who still had to go home and raise their children. Thank you, Erica, for adding that. So once again, I just want us to be mindful of the historical context as we go through this conversation. And at this time, we're going to pull up another slide. We have a few terms that we're going to be using throughout the conversation, and people may not be familiar with them. You might not, but in case you aren't, we've provided some terms here. Would anyone else like to read the one for intensive mothering?
I can read that since I'll be talking about that a little bit later on.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Intensive mothering is a cultural model of appropriate child rearing, according to which mothers should unselfishly make a tremendous investment in their child. Intensive mothering overall is child-centered. expert guided, emotionally absorbing, labor intensive, and financially expensive. Children come first, period.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Mhm.
And our second one is conscious/gentle parenting. This one might be a little bit more familiar to folks, but just in case, we do have a definition here. Erica, would you mind reading that?
Sure, and I'll just go into Miss Afropedia as well.
Okay, thank you.
Patient, calm, and punishment-free, gentle parenting is an evidence-based approach that focuses on empathy, respect, understanding, and boundaries. This is a move away from the prevailing form of parenting, authoritative parenting. And Miss Afropedia, and I forgot the source for that, so you might have to tell me like who we're borrowing the definition from. Hari Ziad is this term Miss Afropedia comes from. And it just talks about the anti-Black disdain for children in childhood that Black children experience, and the childhood that Black children experience, i.e. abuse, imprisonment in the school to prison pipeline. It is a takeoff of misogynoir.
Thank you, Erica. Okay. So these are our terms that might be coming up as we move through the conversation, just to give you all a little context. And I did give the names of my BRJA family that's joining me tonight, but I do want to share that just to give a little bit more context, that Erica, myself, and Rebecca are all parents. And Anthony, who's joining us, is not technically a parent, but he does parent nieces and nephews, to just give a little bit more context. All right. So I want to start off the conversation around intensive mothering, and I want to let Rebecca have the floor and talk a little bit about that.
Sure, definitely. So intensive mothering is a philosophy of how a mother is to appropriately mother. And although it is in theory a colorblind philosophy, it is very much associated with whiteness and with white mothers. And so there's a couple of different principles that sort of come under intensive mothering. One is the idea that children are considered sacred, innocent, inherently loving and trusting. And as such, they need to be protected from the outside world. And so that's one of the key premises that comes in. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that in a second. The next thing is the idea that in order to protect children from the outside world and to help raise them into adults that are happy, successful people, mothers are expected to do several things. They are expected to receive continual and unconditional maternal love. They are expected to do much research to make sure that the ways that they are raising their children are based on evidence-based practices that are based on the sort of studies of experts. And so the idea is mothers must educate themselves on how they ought to mother their children, and then follow those practices as they raise their children. And if there are any problems, they should go and consult a professional about that. This then becomes a very time intensive and also very financially intensive, because you're consulting professionals, you're making sure that your children have the right books, the right toys, the right educational enrichment opportunities. So sort of all of these things are considered to be the domain of a good mother to provide those things for her children. And then the last piece is the idea that this is primarily the domain of mothers. It is, and it is seen to be the domain of mothers because it is seen that motherhood and child rearing is a instinctual thing that is in women. Fathers, and then the corollary to this is that fathers are perceived as more incompetent. And so they can provide supporting help, but really the main work is done by moms. And this philosophy has existed for a while, but it really comes into play as white women start to join the workforce in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Which is really sort of fascinating, that as women are starting to go outside the home to work, white women, white middle-class women, to be more specific, there rises this philosophy that says, no, your job, yes, fine, go out and work, that's fine, but you also have this important, holy, sacred, moral obligation to pour into your children in this way that is very labor intensive, very time intensive, all of these things. And that this is supposed to be this is a moral job, this is a selfless job, all of these different things. And so that is, you can start to see some of the problems with this philosophy as we talk about it. And you can start to see some of the implications. And so if mothers are supposed to protect the innocence of their children, we can see corollaries right now with some of the protests that are going on by white mothers against books about racism, books featuring gay characters, books that are seen as really infringing on their white children's innocence. And so whether consciously or not, when white women are showing up to school board meetings and saying, I do not want my children to read these things, they are upholding this principle of, as a mother, it is my responsibility to keep my child innocent. And as such, innocent of acknowledging racism. Which then really becomes a problem as you move forward and as children grow up and have no understanding of the underpinnings of racism in our society. You also start to see it happening where white mothers and white families start to resource hoard. And so hoarding opportunities. We'll see that a lot in Baltimore City around applications for charter schools, around applications for free supplemental sort of extracurricular activities. Where those things will be sort of shared, and white families and especially white mothers will be like trying to find these opportunities for their children to enrich them, very much following this philosophy, but then sort of resources are being hoarded by white families and then by white children.
Rebecca, how is that different?
Then
how is that? I mean, I want to, can you say more about how that might be different? I mean, like, it's the hoarding of resources has been an historical
thing that white people have done.
Right.
I mean, it's not different, but there's this moral justification behind it, right? So the philosophy lends a moral justification of, I am doing this for my children. It is my responsibility as a mother, as a good mother, to provide my child with all of these opportunities. If I am going to be, if a white mother is following intensive mothering, then it is her responsibility to ensure that her child has access to the best enriching opportunities, even if that is to the detriment of other children.
Mm-hmm.
This is really making me think about schools, especially in Baltimore City.
Yep.
And so I just wanted to put that earmark there. I hope we touch on that later.
Which one of us is going to touch on that later? I can't.
All of us, everybody. And that's also a big draw. I hope as folks are listening too, that Michelle had asked to put questions in the chat, but I think there are things that are popping up that we're all wrestling and grappling with this kind of together. So hold on to those things. There'll definitely be room for all of us to be doing the work. So anyway, Rebecca, I interjected. Go back to what you were saying.
I don't know that I have a lot more if we're thinking about sort of the basis of this intensive mothering, except to say that it, I think that one of the more damaging premises of intensive mothering is that a mother, through all of her work, through protecting her child, through having all of these resources, through showering all of this attention, is able to guarantee that her children will grow up healthy, successful, sort of all the things that we all hope will happen for our children as they grow into adulthood. And one of the real damaging pieces of that ideology is that it really erases any kind of systemic structural issues that are at play.
Yep.
And reduces it all down to the efforts of the individual mother. And so if you have children who are doing well on standardized tests, white children who are doing well on standardized tests, and Black children who are doing poorly on standardized tests, intensive mothering would say, well, white mothers are pouring into their children and Black mothers are not. And that's just not the case. It invisibilizes all of that.
I think there's an opportunity because you're right, and it what do you call it? Invisibilizes.
Yeah, sure.
It makes invisible. It renders invisible the systems that are running through it. And so what I think I'm suggesting then is that intensive parenting is just a new manifestation and not a new ideology. Because when we start to segment these things into new occurrences, we separate it from being able to make the analysis of how it's the same thing wearing different clothes. Because remember, power mutates.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we think about, even if we think about your favorite, if you have one, antebellum movie where there's still like this intensive parenting, like falling over kids, and like if the kids go wrong, it's the woman's fault. I hear variations of that in there. And I think that if we look up at the systems of oppression that are at play here, we do see a lot of anti-Blackness. But we also see a whole lot of misogyny there. Because if your one job on earth is to care for this child. If that child goes awry, you have failed. And what intensive parenting sounds like is the pouring in, so much so that you lose your identity. And I think that image is so prevalent, and it has become so prevalent that it's seductive, because that's what we think the way we are to parent, right? It's been colonized to all of us, right? So we think that if we take a couple of minutes for ourselves or whatever, but my kids come first, all that other stuff. So I just wanted to offer that perspective too about same head, just a prettier hat.
Completely.
I think that's.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
I think that's absolutely true. And this is also reminding me of ways for women to grab power in a misogynist world through motherhood. And you see that throughout history. You can see, I know, Erica, you and I have talked about the idea of maternal colonialism, where white women in the 1800s used their sort of role as white mother to assert power by participating in the Native American boarding schools and the Indian boarding schools, and by participating in the removal of Aboriginal children from their families in Australia. And this idea of taking the power that was accorded as a white woman and as a white mother, and using it in this very specific way that is extraordinarily limiting for the white woman and extraordinarily damaging for those she is supposedly mothering.
Another thing, Rebecca, that you hit on, another way in which intensive parenting is damaging and counterproductive to anti-racism work is this idea and concept around innocence for white children, and wanting to protect the feelings of white children when we talk about racism, when we talk about the history of America. I just wanted us to maybe talk a little bit about that more. How do we push back on this idea? Oh, kids shouldn't hear about genocide. Kids shouldn't hear about slavery. How do we combat that? How do we kind of push back on that a little bit?
it's hard because it's hard because in order to push back on that, you have to challenge that inherent belief in sort of this like innocence and purity of children, and that children can handle difficult things.
Mhm.
And I think that it's a hard ideology, and I'm also thinking about the term that that Hari Zayed had used of the Miss Afropedia, which, you know, the hatred of Black children and the total denying of innocence for Black children, and how those two sort of like are the two sides of this pendulum, right? And so even though intensive mothering in theory says all children should be innocent, really there's a white in parentheses within there, even if it's not spoken.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that there are ways to share things with children that are appropriate to age and historically accurate. And I think that, you know, pushing back by giving examples of ways of talking to kids that are not necessarily going into, you know, just the sort of the way that we have different, you know, different levels of movies, and there might be a movie that alludes to something horrible that's happening, but maybe it's not showing it in graphic detail.
Mhm.
We can
Rebecca,
talk about injustices.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
I think Yvonne was trying to say something there.
Mm-hmm.
You went back on mute though. Yvonne?
Dana, can you unmute her? If that's possible.
No, I can mute, but I can't unmute.
Oh, okay.
Coming back.
Hopefully she'll go ahead.
Something that I was thinking about in what you were mentioning, Rebecca, though, is that even the process and the planning that white parents have, and how do I introduce or talk to my children about whatever it is, race or whatever, are they old enough for this? And the privilege of being able to do that, the parents of color don't have, especially Black parents, right? And that it would be great to be able to say that at a certain age, I'm able to prepare my children to be able to talk about encountering police, but oftentimes that encounter happens a lot sooner than when a parent wanted to have that conversation with them, right? Same thing as we're talking about schooling. A lot of times in schooling, it is said, oh, come here, and like we are very colorblind. And oftentimes we hear stories in our workshops about, oh, I didn't know that color meant something, and so I couldn't sit with my friend, or I could go to this place, or the teacher treated me differently, right? And that these are conversations that parents of color are having with their children, that then white parents get to decide when they want to opt in, or when they want to, you know, choose a film or choose a way to have this discussion. And so just highlighting the privilege and being able to be like, this is when I am ready to and how I want to, that the privilege that Black parents especially don't have.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah. And also that the conversations for white families, when they do talk about racism and white supremacy, often focus on or are limited to talking about the oppressions that are happening to people of color, and never talk about race and racism as it relates to white people and the privileges and the power. And so it might be talking, if you're talking about residential segregation, it might be talking about Black families living in a certain neighborhood, but not talking about how our neighborhood has restricted Black families from moving in. And is overwhelmingly white. And so, and that's something we see again in our participants, are a lot of our white participants coming in saying, if I'm going to talk about race, if I'm going to talk about racism, then I need to tell a story about a person of color. I need to tell a story about a Black person, because I don't see race as relating to myself. That starts as kids.
Right. And another thing too that I'm struck by is that white parents saying, you know, I don't think my children are ready to talk about race. I don't feel comfortable yet talking to them about race. And the thing is, even when we don't explicitly talk about race, children are always receiving messages about race. All children in our society are constantly receiving messages from the things they watch on television, from things that happen in their classrooms. And as white parents, your silence is a message too, right? The things that you choose not to talk about is a message to your children. So whether we explicitly talk about it and take control of the conversation and use that that conversation towards anti-racism work, whether you do that or not, you're still sending a message to your children. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about a time this must have been like 5 years ago or something, because it was with my oldest. And when we drive to school, we go through the predominantly white neighborhoods of Homeland and Roland Park. And then we go through the predominantly Black neighborhoods of Southern Park Heights. And there's a lot that kids can notice as they're going through the window, as they're like looking out the windows, in terms of who's outside, in terms of where there are houses that are boarded up, which houses have, yards that have clearly had a crew of gardeners come and take care of them. And we were maybe, 3 or 4 years into going back and forth, and I realized like we had never talked about this. And so just sort of like opening up the conversation, saying, here is something that I'm noticing, and there's some history behind this. There are reasons that this happens. This is not because this is what white space looks like and this is what Black space looks like. It's because there's history here. There's policies here that are behind this, and trying to break that down a little bit for, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, but trying to sort of give some a sense of the intentionality behind things. Because they were getting all these messages just by looking out the window.
Right.
I think that this may be a good segue into how gentle parenting shows up too, right? And Michelle, I'm not looking at the slides. Do you mind just kind of reading that definition one more again for someone who has access to it?
Dana, do you mind bringing it back up for us?
Not at all, but it's going to take me a minute.
Okay.
It's okay. I mean, I can go ahead and start talking. Hopefully folks saw it or remember it. But as I listen to this conversation around like the etymology or the beginnings of intensive parenting, it seems that gentle parenting may show up as a little bit of a foil, but a false foil though, right? And so gentle parenting is it is also child-centered, so that they share that in common. But it is about recognizing the child as innately valuable as they are, not by what they can be made into. And I think gentle parenting also talks more about children's voice and the empathy that is required of adults to essentially not clip wings, but to allow the full expression, the full expression of what that is. But that also too assumes a bit of innocence as well. So it's not authoritarian, but it does seem to strike a different kind of chord, because it feels like it's the antithesis, not antithesis, maybe it's the antithesis to authoritarian parenting. But I think that if there is a scale there, intensive parenting is kind of like authoritarian, then intensive, and then gentle is a little bit further to the left. Typically when we think about who has, well, let me not put it that way. And maybe this can be a little bit of participation that is involved here. When you think about gentle parenting, what characteristics do you automatically come to your mind when you think about that kind of mothering or that kind of parenting?
You're asking anybody in the audience?
I am. I'm
Okay.
seeing some faces here, just trying to see, like, in control of your emotions, actively listening to your children. Having the space and freedom to do that, right? To my mind, it brings a person who has the space and time to do that. So it sometimes may mean that you're not working outside the home, right? So again, I think it again sometimes can feel like yeah, money, right? It is tied to financial flexibility. So that's why I feel like it may be an expansion of, or like a different turn of intensive mothering, because it is very intensive emotionally. It requires the adult to be in total control of emotions, even when everything is heated, right? So it doesn't allow parents to be human either, right? And I think that that's a really key part of it. But as we see, there are lots of emerging uh, authors and speakers and pundits on gentle parenting of color. One of the ones that I follow is on Instagram is Destiny Ann Davis, who has a pretty decent Instagram following. And she talks about this whole maturity around parenting that involves healing the wounds that we endured as kids, and making sure they don't impact or insert themselves into the way we parent, which requires a whole lot of maturity, a whole lot of self-awareness, and in a busy world, you know, that just becomes another task. And I think one of the things that, and Rebecca, you can disagree with me if you want, but I think intensive parenting has a big part of guilt associated with that for mothers. And I would say that this gentle parenting may have a similar vein to that. So just wanted to think about your perceptions of that as a kind of foil.
Yeah, there's definitely like this sense of perfectionism on behalf of the mother or parent in both of them.
Mhm.
And I mean, I could see both of them dovetailing very nicely, where intensive mothering would have a mother reading all the books on gentle parenting and following all the podcasts on gentle parenting, and you know, taking classes on gentle parenting and practicing. And you know, so like not only the idea of practicing it, but the idea of there's extensive research, extensive pouring of time and energy into the thing.
Mm-hmm. There was another point I think I made when we were preparing for this, which was around, you know, when we think about original and gentle parents, I thought about, I forget when we were talking, y'all, but I thought about, like, if we think about like the origins of this, because of the limitations put on Black women to discipline white children and during the times of slavery, Black women could also be considered the initial authors of gentle parenting, because they could not discipline the children that they were taking care of in the way that they would if they had full license to do that. And so I think that is a pretty ironic point there.
For sure. When you and Rebecca were kind of talking about the ways in which intensive parenting and gentle parenting kind of are similar, I was also thinking about, you know, when we talk about intensive parenting, there's obviously this deficit for anyone who isn't white and middle class or upper class, right? There's this obvious deficit. But I also thinking about with gentle parenting, how much self-work that takes, right? And that if you are a Black parent or a Black mother who more than likely did not come from a gentle parenting household, right? If you were not gentle parented yourself and corporal punishment was used for you and you weren't allowed to express your emotions, you know, old school, what we call old school Black households, right? That gentle parenting can be very difficult for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not just doing the work of parenting, you're also parenting yourself. You're also dealing with your own inner child who did not get to grow up that way, right? And so you are coming to it from an emotional deficit, I would say, because of that holdover and culture from slavery, right? That, you know, Black children are not to be heard, Black children are not to express themselves, Black children are not to act up in public, right? These are all these things. Black children are to be beaten and kept in line. These are all these things that are coming from the slave culture into Black families that make it that much more difficult for a Black mother to gentle parent.
I think if I may take the liberty to ask Yvonne to talk a little bit about how she came to that decision to parent differently and how that was. for her?
I think we lost.
Uh,
She's back.
I'm,
Oh, she's back. Okay, go ahead.
oh, good, you can hear me.
Yes.
Well, it was the influence of my mother, who was orphaned, raised by a loving grandmother until she died, and then taken over by an almost stereotypical evil aunt, to the point of beatings and locking her in the privy because they had an outhouse, and like all Sunday afternoons, that sort of thing. But and I guess clinically, you might say, my mother had a reaction formation. She was not going to do the things in her home that were done to her. But she did believe that her responsibility was to teach her children, Oh, there's an echo. Am I coming through?
I think you're good now.
Oh, okay. Her responsibility was to not only teach us, but demonstrate for us. So she believed that beating children is violence, and she didn't want to raise violent children. She was very loving, but not to the extent of the what was it? All of these terms are new for me. What the gentle parenting, or because she was very firm, and so she just taught us that there are ways to get your point across, and she always made sure she made eye contact with us. She wasn't a yeller and a screamer, and she just taught loving behavior by example, and then tried to teach us just, I would say, more from a moral point of view, even though my father was a Baptist minister, but hers was more humanistic, I guess I would say, and because he was old school Baptist, Old Testament, and he and she had to struggle with that in the marriage because he believed in punishing children. I don't know if that
No, that's great.
addresses how I got to the point that I am. My mother was my role model because it worked. What she was doing worked for me, and I was not an angel, but I just did naughty or poorly thought out things, and then she would teach me better.
This is beautiful, and it's making me think about a conversation I've had with Michelle and others in talking about the decision to parent differently and not necessarily be children, and you talking about the wife and the husband having different approaches to it. And Michelle and I have had discussions about like even being the one or the only one in the family, in the Black family, that's like, I'm not beating my children. And then how do other people, how do aunts, how do cousins, uncles discipline or honor what you have said, that like, hey, I do not beat my children. So you're gonna have to have a conversation with them, or you're gonna have to use a different approach. And so there's one part of it that is just like with other Black folks and in family. And I'm also thinking about the expectation when people are out in public, when Black kids are out in public with their parents and they are having a tantrum, and then the eyes are on the Black parent in a way that is different than what it would be for a white parent, and what that expectation and what that pressure is on that parent to discipline their child in that moment to make them stop crying or whatever, right? That there is a totally different type of patience and grace that's given to a white mother with a kid that's having a tantrum than it would be for a Black mother with a kid that's having a tantrum. And so I'm just thinking about how hard that is for coming from an uncle, from a parent in general, but especially with you saying you could be everybody's grandmother and understanding how hard that could be in like those times. So I think that was beautiful. But Michelle, you were going to say something.
Anthony, I was actually going to say something very similar. Miss Yvonne, I was actually going to say something similar to Anthony. I was curious, for you and your mother, what kind of pushback did you receive pushback from family members and community? I'm genuinely curious to hear about that.
Well, what I heard from my siblings, and I come from a family of 5 boys and 2 girls, and my father only beat my brothers, and he would be harsh with us and maybe yell at us, but that was his limit, and my sister and I could see the injustice with that, but we appreciated the gender difference that protected us. But I'm going to disclose a more intimate story, because I married a man who, when we met in college, I thought was just the perfect gentleman and so gentle and kind and all of that. And then when we started raising children, I found out that in influences of his early experience, he was raised in Barbados, and beating in the home was very common, and also beating in the school. If you didn't get your lessons right, the schoolmaster had a bamboo stick in the room, and he would beat you for incorrect answers. Well, when my husband started grabbing a belt to beat our children, I told him, "You will not touch my children, and if you do, I will take them and leave." And that worked for me, but there were so many other strengths in our relationship that I had that kind of power. But sometimes you just have to take a stand, and I had been a homemaker to that point. But my brothers and my one sister all parented differently than I did, but they appreciated the way what I was doing, and would just talk about it, how nice it was. But I never thought about that, but they could have done it too. I mean, they had the same mother.
Yeah, but it takes tremendous social capital.
I'm getting a little bit more, Erica, I'm getting a little bit more introspective than I had planned to. But this is a wonderful discussion. I love it. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I love that you had the strength to stand up and protect your children. And that is like such an inspiration to me as a mother. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
And then when I lost the seed, Rebecca, I just wanted to reinforce what you said about being, part of being 87 is that I had some short-term memory lapses, but about being age appropriate in teaching these discussions of slavery and Jim Crow, and that we have a debt to our children to be honest, but also as parents to be age appropriate and just give them information as they are able to handle it. And that someone might have said that while I was dropped off, but I just did want to make that point and amplify what you were saying.
Thank you, Ms.
I'm
Yvonne.
done.
I think that's so great that we talk about the age appropriateness. I do want to underscore the fact that sometimes children of color don't get the option of only being taught about that, right? Because the world will step in and make a muck of things. And so those some of those lessons have to be impromptu. And in those moments, it still requires honesty.
I want us to talk a little bit about I feel like we've kind of had this conversation in other forums as well, but I kind of want us to talk a little bit about the struggles that go into attempting to raise free Black children, right? We talked about how, white mothers may just assume this innocence for their children, how it's a thing that's much more accepted, I would say, in white culture and white America. And so for Black mothers who want to raise, when I say free Black children, right? Like if we are attempting to raise children that don't feel as burdened by racism and white supremacy, kind of what does that look like, and what kind of struggles are we coming up against as Black parents in trying to do that?
Michelle, I think it shows up in like the increase in numbers of Black households that are homeschooling.
Or we'll have two starting this week.
I've definitely seen growth in that. Talk a little bit more, Becca.
Well, I think it's like in like, so I've followed a couple of folks who called about like liberation parenting or something like that, where it's just like, we can't expect to raise Black children or children of color in a liberatory mindset in the systems that are designed to inculcate white supremacy and anti-Black racism. And so to believe in those systems is akin to just reproducing the outcomes. And so to separate then from that is the trend towards homeschooling, where the messages and the images can be more controlled and defined in ways that amplify their existence. And I do feel like, as a Black mother of a Black child, I did really try to protect my child before she went to school by surrounding her by images and people that reflected her beauty, because I knew that when she's out and outside of my care and outside of the realm of or sphere of influence that I have, that she will be inundated with other images. And so it's about protecting that bubble as long as possible.
Completely agree about protecting that bubble as long as possible. And I think for me, I have two boys. And I think for me, it's been a struggle between, as they're getting older, right? This struggle between how long do I get to extend this bubble for them? And then at what age and at what size and what height do I now my 11-year-old is 5'7" and on the spectrum, right? and he is perceived as some people see him, he's probably perceived to be an adult, and he's only 11, right? So I know for me, there's this constant struggle between how the world sees my kids and the world I want them to live in, right? So I know for me personally, I definitely struggle with that.
And then I just want to also bring up that there are some other gradations in that, because we don't come from monolithic communities. And so, there's also influences of, not for us specifically, or me specifically, but there are also influences of immigration and how we're raising and that particularly immigrants of color, like the assimilation vote versus how America's treating you based on the way you show up visually. And how do you two marry those things? So that is a part of this conversation that we haven't talked about. And like we have parenting guides or parenting mythos around that, like the tiger mother and other kinds of things that we could probably discuss at a later date. I have to go on mute because there's some Baltimore dirt biking going out there that's drunk. But yeah.
I'm stuck on thinking on this question, Michelle, because and I wonder this for parents, because I've definitely had times, for those of you that don't know me, I love being fun uncle. I love being let's go outside, let's play or do whatever. And there have certainly been times that we'll be at the playground having a good time, and then other kids come up. And especially if it's white kids, it's like, oh, I'm worried that like if there's an interaction where somebody gets hurt, then what's going to happen, right? And so I'm trying to and let them be kids and be fun, like have fun and everything. But I'm thinking about for the parent, what stress are you holding in order for your like Black kids to be in that bubble and live and be free? And I'm like, even in trying to give them that, like, what stress then does the parent hold? Or thinking while they're having a good time and living their best life, it's like, oh my gosh, but I don't want to let them know that I'm stressed. I don't want them to worry about what I'm worrying about, you know, but I definitely, in just like a short times being like, whew, get in the car, glad we going, glad everything was safe. Like, and so I just can't, it's hard for me to wrap my head around what y'all are doing on an everyday and trying to keep them in a bubble or try to keep them to have some sort of freedom before something interrupts that. And so I guess I just want to lift up that there is work in doing that protection that puts stress and load on you all as Black parents, that again, that white parents aren't navigating. And so it also goes back to this double things that are happening. You're trying to parent yourself for possibly things that you have not received, but also trying to protect your child while also trying to give your child freedom. There's a lot that's happening. And I just like, yeah, I just want to lift that. It's a lot.
It is a lot. Thank you, Anthony. You know, I think as a mom, I loved what you said about, not that I love that it's happening, but I don't even think about the stress it causes me, right? Because I'm so focused on protecting them. And there was, really quickly, I remember one time I took the kids to one of the art museums here in Baltimore. And when I tell you the entire time that they were in that museum, I saw the guards there just constantly moving closer to my kids, constantly. They didn't even touch anything. But the way that I saw the way that they were monitored in that space, and it upset me so much. And I never said anything to them. I never asked them to do anything differently because I was intent on making sure they loved that experience and that they didn't pick up on what was happening, even though I was clocking it the entire time and having this whole inner discussion in my head and ready to go off on somebody if they dared say anything to my child, right? But yeah, I just never even think about what's happening internally for us as parents, because once again, I'm like, I just want them to have a good experience. I want them to come away with this and be like, I got to be free in this space, you know? So thank you for lifting that up.
I would like to speak up again. I thought I was finished, but listening to Anthony, I thought of the way my Black son is raising his two Black sons. And that is at the age-appropriate time. He taught them, and I didn't necessarily agree with him at the time, but now I think they have a healthy skepticism. He taught them that white folks are not to be trusted historically, and you don't know which person is going to look at you impartially and which person is going to be biased against you. So you judge white people that you meet on an individual basis, and until they show you otherwise, don't trust them. And I thought that was harsh, but now I see the way they handle themselves. They're now 23 and 27. And I think my son was right, and I'm glad he didn't listen to his mother.
You know, recently I saw something, and someone has to jump in because I hope I'm not the only person that saw it or it came across my feed. But it was a white mom who had taught her child that if you're ever in danger, find a Black man. Mm-hmm. And the reason was because of the attention she knew that dynamic would create, that he would be afraid that anything would happen to this child, and you know what I mean, like, so that kind of protective right, so like, you know, like it builds on like kind of like this constant monitoring and things like that. But it was too it was kind of the talk in reverse of some sort. Did anybody else see this, or am I oh my goodness, I must find it. But yeah, I thought that was a very interesting piece. Yep.
All right. Thank you all for this amazing discussion. Thank you, Ms. Yvonne, for joining us. I really appreciate everything you had to add to the discussion. We
Oh, I
have,
thank Erica for the invitation.
oh, good. And I just wanted to open up the floor to everyone now. If you have any questions, comments, things you want to ask the panel members, maybe you have a question for Ms. Yvonne. Is there anything that anyone would like to ask or comment?
And sorry, can I add also what is standing out in people's head? Because I'm also recognizing we went from slides to kind of having conversation. So like, I'm also wondering what's standing out for folks. Doesn't even have to be a question, but what is something that's gonna like linger in your mind after this session?
Thank you for that, Anthony. And feel free to put it in the chat if you don't feel comfortable sharing out loud.
Are you talking about the list that we were to write when we think about motherhood?
I think that would be appropriate too. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to reflect on your journaling prompt that you had at the beginning and what you were thinking about initially, and maybe it changed, maybe it didn't as the discussion went on. Yeah, if you want to talk about that, feel free.
Alexandra Bell has her hand up.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm new to these conversations. I'm appreciating it a lot. And it's certainly been a while since I've been parenting. And if anything, I probably was trying for that gentle parenting, at least treating my children like human beings and not something I was in control of. But mostly I looked at those things and I thought, oh, all of these are just impossible models for any human being to live up to. So I felt like a whole lot of the point was setting impossible standards for all women and making it virtually impossible for you to be a functioning member of society in any other form except parenting, mothering. And, you know, so all of that is very constricting. I mean, hopefully enough people will continue to have children, but sometimes you wonder if it's, if I were still in my 20s, I might well wonder. And my daughter is 40 is kind of saying, I'm not sure it's going to happen. So.
thank you, Alex. Yeah, so one of the myths I think that a lot of people think is that white supremacy only hurts people of color and Black people, and that's just not true, right? And so the effects that white supremacy has on mothering, it affects all mothers, right? And you're right, it is impossible to achieve these things. Any other reflections? Anything people want to share or ask?
Something else that, sorry, what Alexandra is also saying that I'm not sure that we lifted a lot, that it's also this fits into the standard American society, single family home kind of structure, right? And that it very much feeds into patriarchy and all of this. And so it has that rigidness that's part of it as well. That then makes you, if you are not fitting in this, if you're not able to have the resources to stay at home, which probably means have a partner that can then go to work, then you're still doing something and you're out of line with society. Like, so I just want to put that in there too. Not only is it impossible for like those folks who already have those structures, but once you're out of it, then you're kind of like already disqualified or in violation of what society expects from you.
Very true, Anthony. And to piggyback on that, I was also thinking during the discussion that this Western concept of just the nuclear family, right? That has not been how most humans have lived for the vast majority of human history, right? That people normally live in multi-generational households. And it just feels like there's shame around that in our current society. And I don't think there should be. We were not designed to raise children on our own. We were designed to raise children in a village, with other mothers helping us, with grandmothers helping us. So it's just not even supposed to be like this.
And then I will repeat something I said at the beginning. There are capitalist priorities that don't gain from like being able to exploit you if you were in a village.
Right.
They can exploit the idea of a nuclear family.
Right.
And this is really reminding me of a resource that our colleague Adar had sent, which was an oral interview of a woman who was part of the Black Panthers in Oakland, helped to found I want to say it was the Oakland Free School, but I can't remember the exact name. But she was talking about the sort of the parenting models of parents within the Black Panther Party, and where because parents were often traveling to other cities or involved in other work, or had shifts that took them sort of outside of sort of like traditional like childcare hours. Folks were living communally, and there were adults who were taking care of the kids, and the kids were taken care of, and the kids were loved. And it was not always the biological parents who were the ones who were doing the caring. And so sort of offering that as another way of raising children that then met the needs of children, and also was allowing for this, liberatory work to carry forward.
Thank you for that historical reference, Rebecca. Mm-hmm. Anything else that folks want to share?
Hi, I haven't spoke yet, but I have maybe not the best like formed thought or question, but thank you for everything thus far. It's been amazing. So I think I do not have children, and I am struggling with white friends that are having children, that like around the discussion of, navigating care for their child, and the obliviousness to, with some of them, I'd say most of them, and which has been a little bit surprising, about how, of choosing what school or choosing what daycare, or like having to be on a wait list, or being like, well, we're just going to have to buy a house in this neighborhood because that is, like basically uprooting maybe the community that they've been in and built, just to move to something that's deemed like the best of this or a good this. And I don't know, it's been really bizarre to experience, and like really contradictory of like the things that they said that they cared about and believed in. I don't know. I can expand more if there's you want me to, but that was just a question I had.
Not to put you on the spot, but this is such a Rebecca question.
Gosh. Yeah, it's such a tricky question, right? Because there's each individual family's decisions, and each individual, and I'm hearing these threads, like these whisperings of intensive mothering within the comments that you're making, because if the role of a good parent, of a good mother, is to make sure that their child has the best resources possible, then it makes sense that a mom is going to go out and have all of these questions, and yet it's totally erasing the larger issues at play. And so not really an answer or a what to say. I think all of us as parents are making imperfect choices in a deeply in a badly structured, society, city, inequitable school system, the fact that all schools are not equally resourced. And so there's this, thing that people are trying to go to certain schools that are better resourced. That's a place that individual families are placed into. And so it becomes a yes, and it becomes I as an individual family cannot heal these larger structures. And yet, how do I make ethical choices within these structures at the same time? Yeah. Erica was nodding.
I
Yes,
was
thank
thinking that in addition to like trying to make those ethical choices, to what point are your efforts singularly responsible for making those ethical choices? And I think I've come to that realization and trying and deciding to move my daughter from a public school to a private school. And like, like the thought of like, let's give this opportunity a chance. Let's believe in the system. But then having that part that's like, oh, system just hurt my baby. We gone, right? Someone else has to take up that mantle. I think it like, again, we are making imperfect choices. And for that reason, I really hope that therapy continues, the field of therapy continues for both me and my child in the future, so that she can survive the imperfect choices that I make, right?
Yeah. And I also think that for those of us who are white parents, and for those who are raising white kids, and especially white middle class kids, to think about the privileges that kids have and the amount of there is good enough. And there is sort of like the best of all possible worlds, and then there are, this will be good enough, and my child will be okay.
Mm-hmm.
My child is not actively being harmed in this situation. Is my child, being, challenged every single moment of the day, or, getting all of the best things? Maybe not, but are they getting enough? Are they okay? And I think that's a judgment. That's a judgment too. And I think that for those of us who sit in a place of privilege, there's a lot more space to think about that okayness, and not have to always sort of grasp for more.
I'm also thinking about the privilege of the parent, right? Is there room for you keeping your child there? And is there privileges that your child gets that other kids in the class do not get, that you could be using to bring some attention, or ways that you can be using your privilege to bring resources to a school that might be multiracial, right? And so I'm also thinking about that part of, for parents that are claiming space as ally or in solidarity or doing anti-racist work, recognizing and taking stock of, where do my values lie in this decision to move my child, or am I deciding to move because I don't want to do the hard work and I see that there's issues there? And so I think that being another layer that I think doesn't go into the here's another part that I want to talk about that we don't often, is a lot of times when we're having the conversations about kids, it's about the parents. And like, yes, like something like the school can start off as a like, oh, I'm not sure that my child is getting what I want, or my child is showing this, but the ways in which we are triggered as parents is often the conversation that needs to be had, or what we need to approach head on, and we will often use the kids as the vehicle to kind of detour around that. And so I wanted to say that, I know we're getting around out of time, but I wanted to raise that too as something to also question in all these complicated things we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You are so right to point out that
Mm-hmm.
intergenerational aspect. Parents are a reflection of their parents, as much as they may not want to be, in one form or another, imitation or reaction formation. And there's some things that are just generational. And you're right. We need to be very mindful of how our individual histories, as well as our social history in this country, influences us and the decisions we make as we parent.
Thank you all. I just want to share a few comments that were in the chat. Erica Ford said, I so appreciate the flow of this conversation, opening with historical context and sharing some of the context of these parenting styles and Black motherhood was powerful. So much is staying with me, but the reframe of each of these styles is robbing parents of the humanity is meaningful. I'm personally leaving with a reminder / call-in about resource hoarding and will be checking myself in some areas as a white mom in Baltimore City. Thank you for your comments, Erica. And then Tammy. Oh, Tammy said, I think also consciously not taking something that you or your child could easily have. I think that was talking about the whole questions around schooling. Thank you, Tammy, for that contribution. I just wanted to share what was in the chat. All right, it is 7:27. I so appreciate everyone contributing to this conversation this evening. Thank you all for joining us, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to just listen to the conversation and take in what was being said. I want to thank Ms. Yvonne for joining us and sharing your stories about your family and your kids. We really, really appreciate having you and hearing your voice. I want to thank my panel members, Anthony, Erica, and Rebecca, for giving your time and for talking through this idea with me and then coming and having this conversation tonight. I really appreciate you. And now really quickly, we do have a few workshops that Rebecca is going to share quickly.
Right, we have a busy couple of months coming up. Starting next week, we are going to be starting a new 4-part series for white people, which is about showing up in multiracial spaces. And we're going to be talking about what it means to show up in multiracial spaces as white people, some of the advice and sayings that we have heard over the years about how to show up as white people, and how to really like use discernment as we're thinking about when to speak up, when to be quiet, when to take the lead, when to sit back, sort of all of those things that we juggle as we come into multiracial spaces as white people. I'm going to be one of the facilitators. Dana, who has been teching for us this today, is going to be the other facilitator, and there's going to be 2 cohorts, one in the Wednesday mornings and one Wednesday evenings. And so we're hoping that you all will join us for that or share this with your networks because we're very excited about this. Another thing that is coming up also starting next week is another installment in our Conversations with BRJA series. We have been doing a 3-part series on recruitment, hiring, and then onboarding and retention. And we have been, we're up on our hiring one. And so that is going to be next Thursday from 1:30 to 3. We're going to do one session. If you're not able to make that one, we have another one, which is going to be on April 25th from 10 a.m. to 11:30. And so we would love to see you. And then we will be having a session on onboarding and retention in April. And then we will also be having our 13th of the month coming up on May 13th. The topic is to be determined is in the works, but it'll be another great conversation about a topic intersecting with issues of race and racism. And then, and I see a comment here in the comments about if participating in one, if you can't make the first date, if we can talk about that. The answer is a little bit more complicated than yes or no. And final thing is we ask for folks to support this work financially. These events are free, but they do cost money for us to put on. And so any donations are very much appreciated. We know that you're here because anti-racism, anti-oppression work is important to you. And there are many different ways that you can support us as an organization. You can click on you can scan the QR code. You could also click on the link that Anthony just put in the chat. And you can be a one-time donor, or you can also partner with us by becoming a monthly sustainer. And we very much appreciate all the folks who partner with us in various ways, by showing up to 13ths, by donating to us, by all the different ways that people have shown up. Yeah. I don't know if that's all the slides or not.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. I was gonna do that, but thank you, I appreciate it.
I was like, there's slides. I can keep on talking.
Great job.
That's hilarious.
Everyone for joining us this evening. Please join us again on May 13th. We look forward to seeing you then. Good night, everyone.
Have a great night.
Right.
Good night.